I love camping, always have. There's something about being in the middle of nature, away from the chaos of everyday life, that just feels right. No traffic, no phone calls, no stress, just you, your friends, and the open wilderness. At least that's how I used to feel. Now, now I can't even think about the woods without feeling that sick, gnawing sensation in my stomach. Because something happened to me, to us that weekend. Something I can't explain. And no matter how much I try to forget, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there. Watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip. Nothing crazy, just a couple of nights out in a national park about 4 hours from home. My best friends, Jake and Ryan, had been my camping buddies since college, and we'd done this plenty of times before. We knew what we were doing. We packed up the car, grabbed some beers and supplies, and hit the road early Saturday morning. The drive was long but fun, filled with the usual banter, music, and jokes. The plan was simple: hike a few miles in, set up camp, and just relax. And at first, that's exactly what we did. We found the perfect spot, a small clearing surrounded by trees, far enough from the main trails that we wouldn't be disturbed. The air was crisp, the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. It felt perfect, peaceful. We spent the first few hours setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and just enjoying the quiet. As the sun started to set, we built a fire, cracked open some beers, and settled in for the night. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt. Then we saw him. Jake noticed him first. "Yo, who's that?" he said, pointing toward the tree line. I turned, following his gaze, and my stomach immediately tightened. There, standing just at the edge of the trees, was a man. He wasn't walking, wasn't making any noise, just standing. His face was mostly obscured by the shadows, but I could see that he was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and he was staring right at us. "Maybe he's lost," Ryan suggested, though his voice didn't sound confident. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward him. Nothing. No reaction. "Hey, man," Jake called out. "You good?" Silence. He didn't even flinch. We sat there for a few moments, waiting for him to say something, to wave, to do anything. But he just stood there, completely still. The fire crackled, the wind rustled the trees, and yet, he didn't move. I felt a cold shiver crawl up my spine. "Okay, this is weird, Ryan muttered. "What do we do?" We talked about going over there, asking if he was okay, but something about him, about the way he just stood there, made my skin crawl. Eventually, we decided to ignore him. Maybe he was just some weirdo passing through, and if we didn't acknowledge him, he'd go away. But he didn't. Hours passed, and every time we glanced over, he was still there, unmoving, just standing. None of us could relax after that. We tried to keep the conversation going, tried to act like we weren't freaked out, but it was obvious. We were all on edge. Every few minutes, one of us would glance toward the tree line, checking to see if he was still there. He always was. Eventually, we decided to turn in. I don't know how, but we convinced ourselves that he'd leave once we stopped paying attention to him. I lay in my tent, listening to the wind, to the rustling leaves, and to the silence where his footsteps should have been. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. Then sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. There was no sound, no sudden movement, just that deep, gut-wrenching feeling of something being wrong. I turned over, slowly unzipping my tent just a fraction, just enough to peek outside, and my blood ran cold. He was still there, only now he was closer. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He was standing at the very edge of our campsite, maybe 15 feet away, just standing. His face was still hidden beneath his hoodie, but I could see him more clearly now. His pale hands, his rigid posture, the way his head was slightly tilted, as if he were studying us, as if he were waiting for something. My heart pounded so hard I thought he might hear it. I wanted to wake Jake and Ryan, but I was afraid that if I moved, if I made a sound, he'd come closer. I don't know how long I lay there staring at him, barely breathing, and then I blinked, and he was gone. When morning came, I told Jake and Ryan everything. They hadn't seen him move either, but we all agreed. We were getting the hell out of there. We packed up fast and started hiking back to the car. The whole way, I felt uneasy. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced we were being watched. The woods didn't feel peaceful anymore. They felt wrong. Then about halfway back, Ryan stopped suddenly. "Dude," he whispered, his face pale. I followed his gaze, and there he was, standing just off the trail, 10 feet away. No movement, no sound, just standing. "Don't say anything," I whispered. "Just keep walking." We did, and as we passed him, I saw it. His head, slowly, deliberately, turned to watch us. His body didn't move, just his head. I didn't look back again. When we finally reached the car, we threw our bags in and locked the doors. Ryan let out a nervous laugh. "That was the creepiest thing I've ever..." Jake cut him off. "Dude, he's still there." I turned, and my stomach dropped. At the edge of the parking lot, right where the trees met the pavement, he was standing, watching, waiting. We didn't waste another second. We peeled out of there, speeding down the dirt road, hearts pounding, and we never went back. I don't know who he was. I don't know what he wanted. But sometimes late at night, I still see him, standing at the edge of my room, watching, waiting. I've always enjoyed solo camping. Most people find the idea unsettling, being alone in the middle of the woods, miles away from civilization. But for me, it was peaceful. There was something about the quiet, the isolation, that I found calming. At least that's how I used to feel. Last summer, I took a trip to a national forest I had never been to before. It wasn't too far from home, just a 4-hour drive, but it was remote enough that I knew I wouldn't run into too many people. I planned a 3-day solo camping trip, hiking about 6 miles into the woods to a secluded spot by a lake. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. The first day was uneventful. I parked my car at the trailhead, loaded up my gear, and started my hike. The forest was beautiful, tall pines stretching endlessly in every direction, the sound of birds echoing through the trees. I reached the lake by the afternoon, set up my tent, and spent the evening by the fire, watching the sunset reflect off the water. The weirdness started the next morning. I woke up to find an abandoned campsite not far from mine. It wasn't there the day before. I was sure of it. It looked like someone had left in a hurry. There was a small one-person tent, partially collapsed with a sleeping bag still inside. A campfire pit had been dug, but there were no ashes, like it had never been used. A backpack was leaning against a tree, zipped up but covered in dirt, like it had been there for a while. I called out, asking if anyone was there. Silence. I stood there for a long time, debating whether to check inside the tent. Something about it felt wrong. Finally, I walked over and pulled the zipper down. The inside was empty, except for a few pieces of clothing and a flashlight lying on the ground. No food, no personal belongings, nothing that suggested someone had actually been living there. It was like someone had set up camp and then disappeared. The uneasiness settled in my chest, but I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe a hiker had left it behind, planning to come back. Maybe someone had packed up but forgotten a few things. It was weird but not impossible. I spent the day fishing at the lake, trying to ignore the strange feeling gnawing at me. As the sun started to set, I made my way back to camp, but something felt different. The abandoned campsite looked disturbed. The tent was now fully collapsed, as if someone had tripped over it or pulled it down. The backpack was gone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I knew what I had seen that morning. The backpack had been right there. Trying to stay calm, I told myself maybe an animal had dragged it off, or maybe the owner had come back while I was at the lake. But deep down, something didn't feel right. That night I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up to every little noise. The wind rustling the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. Around 2 a.m., I thought I heard something moving outside my tent, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching against the leaves. I held my breath, listening. Silence. Then, a twig snapped. I sat up, heart pounding. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent just a crack, shining the light outside. Nothing, just the trees, the darkness, and the eerie stillness of the night. I told myself it was just an animal and forced myself to lie back down, but I barely slept after that. The next morning, I decided to cut my trip short. Something about that place felt wrong, and I wasn't going to stick around to find out why. I packed up my gear and started hiking back toward my car. About 2 miles into the hike, I noticed something strange. Footprints, not mine. Fresh, deep footprints in the dirt, leading in the same direction I was going. At first, I thought maybe it was just another hiker, but the more I looked, the more uneasy I became. The prints weren't from hiking boots. They were from something lighter, maybe sneakers. And they weren't spaced like normal walking steps. They were close together, uneven, almost like whoever made them had been shuffling. I kept walking, my pace picking up. The further I went, the more my anxiety grew. The prints stayed ahead of me, always leading in the same direction. It was like someone had walked this exact path right before me. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the trail, partially hidden by some bushes, the missing backpack. It was the same one from the abandoned campsite, dirty, torn, and now covered in leaves. I didn't stop. I didn't even look inside. I just ran. I don't know why. I don't know what I was afraid of. But every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get the hell out of there. I ran the last mile back to my car, throwing my pack inside and locking the doors before catching my breath. As I sat there trying to calm myself down, I glanced back at the trail. And I swear, for just a second, I saw movement. A figure just barely visible through the trees, standing still, watching. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I started the car and got the hell out of there, speeding down the dirt road until I reached the highway. I don't know what happened that weekend. I don't know whose campsite that was or why those footprints seemed to follow me, but I haven't gone solo camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. Camping had always been something my older brother Mark and I did together. It was our thing. Growing up, our dad would take us on weekend trips into the wilderness, teaching us how to build fires, purify water, and navigate using just a map and compass. After he passed away, Mark and I kept the tradition alive. Every year, we'd pick a new remote location, drive out, and spend a few days away from the noise of everyday life. Last summer, we decided to go bigger than usual. Instead of a simple weekend trip, we planned a full 5-day excursion deep into a national forest. No designated campsites, no trails, just raw wilderness. Mark had found the spot on an old topographic map, an isolated clearing near a slow-moving river, miles from the nearest road. It was perfect, or so we thought. The first day went smoothly. We arrived in the early afternoon, hiked for about 6 miles into the dense forest, and found the clearing without any trouble. It was beautiful. Tall trees surrounded us on all sides. The river was calm, and the air smelled fresh and untouched. We set up camp quickly, pitching our tent near the water and gathering firewood as the sun dipped below the treetops. Everything felt peaceful, normal. That night we sat by the fire, drinking a couple of beers and reminiscing about past trips. We talked about Dad, about life, about how Mark was thinking of proposing to his girlfriend. The conversation was light and the air was cool but comfortable. Then we heard it. At first it was just the occasional rustling in the distance. Nothing unusual. Animals move around at night all the time, and we were deep in their territory. But as the hours passed, the noises became more deliberate, more rhythmic. Something was pacing in the woods just beyond our campsite. Mark noticed it first. He paused mid-sentence, staring into the trees behind me. "You hear that?" he asked. I turned, listening. The fire crackled between us, casting long shadows against the trunks of the towering pines. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Slow, deliberate steps, moving back and forth. I shined my flashlight in the direction of the sound, expecting to see the reflective eyes of a deer or some other animal. But there was nothing, just trees and darkness. Mark grabbed his hatchet, his posture tense. "Could be a bear," he muttered. I shook my head. Bears don't pace like that. For the next few minutes, we sat in silence, listening. The footsteps would stop for a while, then start again, closer. Then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped altogether. The rest of the night was eerily quiet. Neither of us got much sleep. The next morning, we tried to shake off the unease. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe we were just on edge because we weren't used to being this far from civilization. We spent the day fishing at the river and exploring the area, finding old animal trails and the occasional set of deer tracks. The forest was dense, but nothing about it felt wrong. By the time the sun started to set, we had convinced ourselves the pacing noises from the night before were just a product of overactive imaginations. Then, as we returned to our campsite, we saw something that stopped us in our tracks. A rock, a large, heavy rock, sitting directly in front of our tent. It hadn't been there when we left. Mark and I exchanged a glance. "That wasn't here before," I said, stating the obvious. Mark walked over and nudged it with his boot. It was solid, heavy, not something the wind could have rolled over. "You think someone's messing with us?" I asked, my voice lower than I intended. Mark scanned the tree line, his jaw clenched. "There's no one out here but us." We left the rock where it was and spent the rest of the evening on edge. Every little sound made us jump. The rustling of the leaves, the distant calls of owls. It all felt off, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That night, we kept the fire burning longer than usual. Neither of us wanted to be the first to go to sleep. Around midnight, I was just starting to drift off when I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps. This time, much closer than before. I sat up, gripping the flashlight beside me. Mark was already awake, his hatchet in hand. The steps stopped just outside the glow of the firelight. We sat there, frozen, listening. Then, a wheezing breath. Low. Raspy. Not an animal, not the wind. Something human. I felt my blood turn to ice. "Who's out there?" Mark shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. Silence. Then the sound of footsteps retreating into the woods. Fast, unnatural. Almost like whoever, or whatever it was, had been watching us and decided to leave only when confronted. Neither of us slept after that. At first light, we made the decision to leave. 5 days in the wilderness wasn't worth whatever the hell was going on out here. We packed up as fast as we could, stuffing gear into our packs, not even bothering to eat breakfast. As we were about to leave, Mark stopped suddenly. "Look at this." I followed his gaze. Carved into the bark of a nearby tree were deep, jagged scratches. Not from an animal. These were letters. "Leave." A single word etched roughly, like someone had done it in a hurry. My stomach dropped. That was it. That was our final sign. We practically jogged back toward the direction of the truck, not stopping to rest. Every so often, I swore I heard something in the distance. Quick, light footsteps paralleling us, following us. The feeling of being watched never left. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the truck, threw our gear into the back, and sped down the dirt road without looking back. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't escaping something. We were being let go. Mark and I never spoke about that trip again. We told our friends we cut it short because of bad weather. We avoided any discussions about the noises, the rock, the footprints, or the warning carved into the tree. But deep down, we both knew something wasn't right in those woods. And someone or something had been out there with us, watching, waiting. And that wraps up today's story. I really hope it resonated with you or gave you something to think about. Stories like these are what keep me passionate about creating, and your support makes it all worthwhile. If you've got any thoughts, opinions, or even your own experiences to share, don't hold back. Drop them in the comments. I'd love to start a conversation and hear from you. And if you enjoyed this video and want to see more content like this, make sure you stick around. I've got plenty more coming that I think you'll love. Thanks so much for watching, for being here, and for supporting this journey. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.